All right. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So nice to meet everybody today. My name is Travis Miller. I'm the General Counsel for Assent Compliance, and I'll be your primary speaker today. If you have any questions, you'll notice in the top right-hand side of your screen there's a little toggle bar. You can open that up, and within it there'll be a little questions box. You can also feel free to type anything inside of that area, and we'll be sure to get back to you in the event that the clock beats us and we don't get to everybody's question before the end of the day. In terms of our agenda, I'm just going to go through a couple of those points before we really kind of dive into the meat and potatoes or the content here. So the first area we're going to talk about is the history of the anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws, where they came from, how they originated, where they are now, because it will help us to understand where we're going and what some of the big instrumental changes have been over the last couple of years. We're also going to take a moment to focus on what constitutes or who is a government official. That's a very important term of art when it comes to ACAB rules and laws. We're also going to touch on Yates and personal liability. If you don't know what Yates is, you're going to want to pay attention to that section, and it's going to get a lot of attention over the coming years as increased prosecutions start to flow based upon what came out of that particular memorandum. Next, we're going to transition over to what actually constitutes a typical or a traditional anti-corruption, anti-bribery program within a corporation, and how it is that some of those programs might be a little lacking for where the rules and laws have come to. We're going to take a look at some gaps, some fines, and some issue spotting that you should be aware of that has come out of some of the most recent case law and decisions that have come down on this topic. And then finally, we're going to close up with something that I refer to generally as supply chain due diligence. What's necessary, what's required, and what's coming your way in the coming years as you start to receive some of those surveys and be expected to, of course, push them out yourself. Now, in terms of Assent, just giving you some introduction to the company for those of you that are unfamiliar, we very much see ourselves as a compliance partner. We offer a platform-based software solution for a wide range of rules and regulations. In terms of it, the anti-corruption, anti-bribery suite is just one small portion of what we do. It falls generally under our ethical sourcing suite and aligns very closely to other programs. For example, anti-human trafficking, conflict minerals, supplier code of conduct rules, even some of the other more general regulations like the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act or the UK Modern Slavery Act. You'll notice on this slide that we also do a number of other rule sets. For example, materials management, which covers rules and regulations like REACH, ROS, California Prop 65, and a whole other series of disclosures known as full material content disclosure. We also have a configurable series of surveys and declarable. Now, these are designed to give companies the ability to identify and troubleshoot certain rules and regulations that are important to them without being confined to a specific series of substances or materials that they have to disclose. And we find that to be a very useful feature of the tool. You'll also notice that we deal with safety data, and that can be anything from factory inspections to product inspections and investigations, internal audits, or even safety data tests, looking at and helping you to administer the programs that allow you to demonstrate compliance with a lot of the conformity rules and regulations that apply. So you'll see here that all of these suites kind of make up the general platform that many of our clients rely upon to help them support the wide range of international compliance rules and regulations that are emerging and becoming a critical part of your ability to do business in our globalized economy. Now, one critical aspect I'll touch on, this will be the final bit before we kind of really get into the content, is that Assent's goal, and when we work with you, we really try to make it easy. Now, that's an acronym that's been developed by the company that's intended to allow you to understand that we offer expertise, automation, scalability as we work with your data. Now, each of those has a specific element or functionality that's important to understand. So when we say expertise, we mean that Assent invests and we built a team of compliant subject matter experts whose job it is to specifically ensure that your programs meet these requirements. We provide your teams with the supply chain and regulatory guidance, training, support, and whatever other aspects you might need to make sure that you're successful. We do this so we can stay ahead of the shifting regulatory landscape and make sure that your programs and the knowledge that you're able to convey to your senior management is always up to date and is always accurate and true. Next, we offer automation. Now, when we say automation, we mean that manual data collection, data entry, and data reporting demand high resource costs. And the only way that you can really combat or start to mitigate that is through automating some of those standard or normalized processes that happen as you engage in the supply chain. Assent does that through our critically acclaimed software and some of our compliance specialty programs that have been developed to help you save time and money. Next, you'll notice that there's scalability on that particular platform. Now, one of the things that's truly unique and special about Assent is that we offer a scalable solution that can help you with your growing supply chain. All of us are dealing in a very globalized economy and environment now, where there are different parts, suppliers, service providers, third parties, consultants, and customers that can be in any place in the globe looking for the same pieces, parts, and components that comprise our products. In order for us to manage that, and to have a vendor or a third party that can help you with some of these compliance obligations, you want somebody that can grow with you, that doesn't put limits on what you can do or the data that you can use and leverage within the system. That's an area that Assent truly prides itself on. Now lastly there, you'll see the Y stands for your data. That's something when you work with us in Assent, you'll recognize very quickly that we believe very truly in. The data that we have that you give us the privilege of working with is yours. And our entire platform is basically built for the collection, processing, and reporting of your data to you, us just facilitating those supply chain engagements and transactions, and giving you a one-touch supplier portal and email campaign manager that offers you the ability to have a very succinct and successful supply chain engagement program. All right, with that limited bit, let's go ahead and jump into the topic today about mitigating anti-corruption, anti-bribery risk. Now, the history of ACAB is actually pretty darn interesting. You see, the United States passed the first anti-corruption, anti-bribery law in 1997, and it really emerged out of the Watergate scandals that were looking into the sitting U.S. President Richard Nixon. Well, the results of those investigations were actually quite staggering, revealing that over 400 U.S. companies had developed so-called slush funds, where they had been channeling hundreds of millions of dollars to governments as bribes. So just to give you a comparison, if you were to look at what $400 million in 1997 might look like, that's about $1.5 billion flowing in to illicit kind of bribery campaigns, well-organized ones in modern money and parlance. And what happened here is that the Church Committee looked into several key and some of the very largest U.S. companies at the time, including Gulf Oil, Northrop Grumman, Mobil Oil, and Lockheed Martin. And Chairman Roderick Hills, who was in charge of the SEC investigation that was going on, found that across the board in many of these companies, and we're talking pretty much as a normal standard of practice going out there, is that there were key activities that were going on that ended up serving as the basis for what became the Federal Corrupt Practices Act. There were bonuses that were going to certain employees, but were actually being rebated and stored in slush funds for use to make illegal political contributions. There was the use of offshore corporate subsidiaries to cover up illegal or ill-gotten payments to domestic and foreign political groups. There were foreign corporations that were set up and were used exclusively as depositors for illegal kickback payments on purchases. There were payments to foreign consultants for the commercial bribery and for payments to domestic political contributions. There were direct corporate payments that were flowing to foreign government officials in exchange for favorable business concessions. And there was a general lack of any accounting or tracking of where or how these funds were managed. In fact, there were monstrous slush funds that existed at the time where nobody had to report any withdrawals, where that money was going, or what it was being used for. And this is perceived as a very significant problem, as you might estimate. However, it was only really 50 or so years ago that these practices were just deemed very normal in terms of engaging in the international markets. So when the law came about, it was revolutionary. It was groundbreaking, but it was also very slow to make any kind of a difference. In fact, companies were originally very adamant that by passing the FCPA and some of these rules, the ability to bribe government officials would eventually lead to a competitive disadvantage. And it would dissuade U.S. companies from being able to gauge or to take advantage of some of those open or free market enterprises that existed in the international community. As a result, the SEC and also the government officials that were charged with kind of driving this to fruition were very cautious about proceeding with enforcement. In fact, there were only about 4 cases that were settled in the first 3 years of the law's existence. And there wasn't a lot of punishment or other kinds of actions taken against any individuals who might have been responsible. In fact, the law was very vague in terms of how it was written. So while companies were nervous about the potential implications, there wasn't a lot of cases or case laws to drive home what it was that they were supposed to do. Now, I've always found this limited enforcement to be pretty darn remarkable, considering the sheer number or volume of corporations that the SEC had already investigated and found to have admitted or had identified as having illegal practices during the Watergate investigation. So what it roughly translated to was that companies just really didn't fear the impact. And largely the FCPA was left as a dead piece of legislation. It just kind of mulled along and was on the books in case something really devastating happened, but was never really enforced to any degree. And that pace kind of continued very sluggishly, and there was a reluctance of U.S. companies to really engage in international or foreign trade, but it wasn't something that was really changing the corporate practices. And that was really until about 1988. Now, 1988 was a very big and important year for the FCPA and anti-bribery, anti-corruption legislation, generally speaking, because that was the year when the U.S. government made a fundamental change to what they were going to do and how the law was going to be implemented. And they did so by increasing or changing the scope to also include foreign companies that committed offenses within the United States or that had some level of interaction with the United States, taking advantage of it. So that jurisdictional definition change was probably one of the most instrumental or biggest deviations to the way the FCPA had been enforced into perpetuity. The amendment further required the President to pursue an international anti-bribery agreement with member countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Organization, the OECD, which is also quite impactful because that then would become a treaty that would allow some of these rules to start to promulgate much more broadly across the globe. And finally, the amendment would prove to be a critical element that would really change the global view on how corruption would occur. Because it had always been the issue that the accounting practices were really deemed quite expensive, accounting for about a 35% increase in the cost to do some of the accounting. But being able to enforce it had always been the greatest challenge, because so much of the information, the data, the records of the actual bribery and corruption were maintained or housed overseas, where most of it actually occurred. But since '88, the rules start to move much swifter, and a lot of the bigger fines that we start to see today started to take their first shape. In fact, in '92 was really when the first big eye-opening fine hit, and GE was hit with a record at the time $70 million fine. Then in 2002, the Enron collapse occurred, and the WorldCom scandals followed shortly thereafter, which then kind of created the political impetus and will to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which started to hold senior executives personally liable for the financial malfeasances of the business. That followed by the oil for food scandal in 2004, which broke and showed about $1.8 billion in bribes being paid to the Iraqi government in exchange for beneficial abilities to gain access to some of their lucrative oil revenues and markets. That followed pretty shortly by the U.S. FBI adding specific division dedicated to FCPA enforcement over the next year, which followed pretty quickly by Siemens being hit with the still record $1.6 billion fine for pervasive global bribery activities. Then most recently, we've encountered the Yates memo, which will be the topic of conversation to follow, which kind of really started to shift the focus from looking at these individual companies and really trying to get those eye-opening penalties and fines against the company to starting to look much more poignantly and directly at the individuals who should have been doing the oversight or tasked with administering these things. So this leads to one of the fundamental questions that always plagues the FCPA. What exactly is a government official? And what is illegal behavior under the rules and regulations? Well, really, the FCPA defines a government actor as somebody who basically is not privately owned, does not have state funding, does not have any ownership, that has any relationship to the government or government-appointed officials. So if you think about that, and the way I always kind of think about it, unless you can kind of prove or demonstrate all of those aspects, you have a risk of a potential FCPA violation if any kind of bribery or illicit payments might happen. So I always kind of classify it generally as that category of individuals versus everybody else. And when it comes to a foreign official definition, this is where it can get really murky. Because you see, any officer or employee of a foreign government or any department, agency, instrumentality thereof, or any public international organization or any person acting in official capacity for or on behalf of any such government or department, agency, or instrumentality, or for any belief of such public international organization, behalf of any such public international organization, could be considered a foreign official, which is a truly incredibly broad definition and allows that definition to cover a huge swath of individuals who even in the United States might not necessarily be considered foreign officials. Because what you'll find as you start to practice or do more business internationally is that where the government actually offers some aid or sponsorship or maintains some control can become much more murky than it is in the United States, where there's much more clear-cut definitions between the private and the public sector. Now, as of right now, the courts have not really taken up defining that state-owned company's qualification, which has really kind of forced a lot of individuals into a hyper-conservative stance or a very risk-oriented or risk-averse stance when it comes to these types of definitions. And then following that is where the Yates memo started to kick in. And this really started to raise the stakes. You see, because what the Yates memo said, in a nutshell, is that the DOJ is not going to be messing around anymore. You see, for some reason, people have historically always kind of underestimated the implications of the FCPA. And that's a little odd, because there's actually been billions and billions of dollars in fines, regulatory control spend, and legal fees that have originated out of this law over the course of the last 40 years. So this really led the Department of Justice to think about it. Why is it that companies and businesses are not paying enough attention to this? What is it that we've been doing wrong? And this is what they kind of came up with. Well, the DOJ started to believe that they had been exerting pressure in the wrong place. You see, the law had always focused on taking profits, disgorgements often called, from a company and from the investors. However, in practicality, by the time a case is settled and the bad actors have been identified, very often they've already left the company. They'd already been paid bonuses or commissions for the illegal activities that won the business. So the only person that was really getting punished by a lot of those fines was the investors, the owners, people that didn't actually have control over the activities. So Yates started to react to this, and they did so by drafting this memo, which focuses or is supposed to focus prosecutorial activity on the persons responsible for the bad actions and on the managers of those persons who should have been charged with the oversight of those individuals. So, kind of a key fundamental change. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, combined with all the different rules and regulations that had gone on, the United States pushed in 1988 for the U.S. to adopt and to push the OECD guidance and the OECD documented treaties that were coming out. And as a result, the world is now pretty flush with legal restrictions on bribery. You can see all these highlighted countries are all the countries that actually have rules outlawing bribery and corruption in some way, shape, or form. Now, not all of them enforce them to the same degree, and the laws are certainly not the same. What constitutes a bribe in one area, it could be a very normal transaction in another. But there are a couple key areas that we need to take a look at because they actually go beyond and can force our anti-corruption, anti-bribery programs to have to adapt and change. One such law is the UK Bribery Act. So the UK Bribery Act came into force in 2011. Now this law act is actually broader in scope than the U.S. Federal Corrupt Practices Act. How so, you might ask? Well, it forces companies with operations in the United Kingdom to also have to review and adopt programs that prevent bribes offered to any person, any commercial individual, whereas the U.S. FCPA's focus is really on transactions with that broad-term government officials. So the UK rules actually take it a little beyond that and force us to kind of reevaluate or relook at what we've done to make sure that we're also looking at just purely commercial transactions. So that definition is probably a little less important since the UK law came into effect. Now the offense itself requires the briber to intend to bring about or reward an improper performance of a function or activity, which would be evaluated under a reasonable person standard, which is a very subjective thing. And another important area that we have to recognize as we put our attorney or our legal hats on is that what constitutes a reasonable person in one country might actually be quite different than what might constitute a reasonable person in another. So the case law and the definitions and some of the background on that need to be reviewed and evaluated by local or independent counsel. The UK law also takes a deviation by making the person receiving the bribe liable. So that way both parties to the transaction can become in trouble, including even potentially the government official. Now the crime itself has special provisions applicable to public officials, being as much as that the briber intends to influence the foreign public official in his capacity as such, and he intends to obtain or retain business or an advantage in the conduct of law, and then the payment or advantage cannot be permitted or required by the written law applicable to the foreign public official. So those are the three elements, or what might also be classified as the mens rea, or the mental state and activities that have to go on to violate this rule in relation to public officials. So with all that said, what's the key thing for you to take away? Well, in practice, because of the UK Bribery Act, bribes to non-governmental persons are in scope and have to be considered by our general anti-corruption, anti-bribery programs as we bring those in-house. There's a second one that I wanted just to pay a second of attention to as we go on, because it adds a lot more to the discussion as well. And I'm going to transition away from just the US-centric and then the UK-centric rules into more broader anti-corruption, anti-bribery programs. And this is actually the People's Republic of China, the PRC, I've abbreviated it, Ninth Amendment to criminal law, which is a little interesting because it's a much more prescriptive, classified legal regime that comes out of the criminal law books as opposed to being a defined and a distinct legislative mandate like the FCPA or the UK Modern Bribery Act. In this rule set, the ACAB provisions of the PRC criminal law make it a crime to offer a bribe to state work personnel, former state work personnel, and also, here's the important bit, the immediate relatives or associates with close relationships to a current or former SWP. So that's a really important, kind of a mind-blowing concept. And then if you even solicit, gift, offer specific incentives to some individual who is not the government official, who is not engaged in the commercial transaction, but might have the ability to influence that government official, or that individual, you could potentially find yourself afoul of the Ninth Amendment to criminal law in the People's Republic of China. The law also brings increased scrutiny and prosecution against individuals. So China is taking that same stance that the U.S. is, focusing on individuals, as that could be really the pinch point or the deviation to control the illicit behavior. It gives flexibility to prosecute the government officials. So again, both sides of the coin, the briber and the bribee. It offers no sentence reductions or parole for serious offenders, meaning what we might classify, or a U.S. perspective might think of as truth in sentencing. It means that once you've been sentenced to these types of crimes, and if it's deemed a serious offense, you're stuck with it. And it eliminates or reduces the mitigating effects of self-reporting, meaning that if you do a voluntary disclosure in China, it's not necessarily going to get you out of the potential rules, and it's certainly not going to have the former effect, which was a very significant mitigating rationale. So what's your key takeaway on this one now? Well, really, it's that even bribing individuals with ties to a government official or somebody who could be deemed to have the ability to offer some influence could potentially get not just you, but also that government official in pretty major trouble. So putting that all together, we have the general overarching rule set, which is really the baseline for most anti-corruption rules in the FCPA, which have begun to focus on personal individual liability for anybody dealing with government officials. That was expanded by the UK rules to also cover commercial transactions. And then we've got the People's Republic of China rules, which have also further expanded a globalized anti-corruption, anti-bribery program to also have to focus on individuals who could influence that government official. Putting that all together, you've got a pretty wide swath that needs to be covered by a new anti-corruption, anti-bribery program, or that needs to be amended to existing ones. All right, so enough of the history lesson. You're probably nodding your head right now wondering, why do I care about this? Why is this guy still talking to me about anti-corruption, anti-bribery? Well, he did sign on to the webinar, so take it with a grain of salt. Well, really what we're getting to here is, what does a traditional corporate AC/AV program look like? And is it focused on the right things in light of some of these big major changes and implications? Well, you see, if you look at it historically, companies have very much focused on internal controls, accounting standards, reviewing what's going on, offering internal training, offering internal guidance, setting up internal whistleblower hotlines. Very self-reflective, very introspective when it comes to these rules. However, all these rule sets and regulations are broadening that picture. And many of them, everything from the PRC focus on individuals who might be able to support, anything focused on commercial transactions, all these areas are really focused on third-party or intermediary expansion. And if you look at the general impacts that are happening and where most of these investigations are originating now, they're not coming out of the former WorldCom or the Enron type of systematized internal fraud, bribery, corporate issues, because a lot of those have been worked on, they've been fleshed out. Now a lot of these investigations are originating when it comes to a third-party transaction, or a third party doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and then that coming back to taint the company that they're engaged with. So let's take a little bit more of a look at that and ask, why is this the case? Well, realistically speaking, in this day and age, internal staff have been trained. You know, the concept that a bribe is regulated is no longer novel or new, at least when it comes to most, modern, large-scale corporations. Therefore, we've reached what's kind of a tipping point or a critical point, where the return on investment for purely internal focused programs is starting to diminish, or it already has diminished in many instances. And most serious penalties in AC/AV cases are no longer originating from some type of a major breakdown in internal policy or program. There's still some that come out and make big news, but for the most part, they originate from a malfeasance being conducted by some type of a third party, an agent, a distributor, somebody that's a consultant, somebody that's been hired to help you get into a new market. And those individuals exist within your supply chain, not within your corporation itself. So when it comes to gaps, what kind of gaps really exist in the traditional anti-corruption, anti-bribery program? Well, if you think about it, most global companies have three principal components to an ACAB program. The first is internal training and whistleblower hotlines, ways that you can identify that this risk actually exists, and you're doing everything you can to monitor and evaluate it. The second is internal financial and auditing controls. That's actually a pretty critical one because it's where the majority of the spend happens. It's also where a majority of the self-identified issues come from. Somebody in finance identifies that there's a potential issue. As we mentioned earlier in the program, there's about a 35% increase in the corporate accounting and finance spend because of some of these rules that came into effect. And that was even before Sarbanes-Oxley hit, which only ramped it up higher. And then third, there's policies that define what constitutes acceptable gifts, expenses, engagement expectations, and so on and so forth, which further kind of refine and even are directed on occasion to customers or other individuals downstream. But what they don't cover, and what significantly fewer global companies start to look at, is how anti-corruption, anti-bribery supply chain due diligence inquiries should be structured. How you need to have, or what you should do to have an externally facing whistleblower hotline to see if maybe somebody in one of those third-party intermediaries, some consultant, some downstream individual can contact you rather than the Department of Justice or the PRC enforcement authorities. Having some level of investigation or screening conducted on the third-party agents, distributors, or consultants related to the ACAB risks, rather than just hiring them and expecting them to do the right thing because they're an expert in your local economy. Now, why is this the case when so many of the recent enforcement activities have come from these third parties? Well, essentially, when you look at the data and when companies are asked, why is it that you don't focus on your supply chain when it comes to ACAB, when that's where a lot of the risk is? They usually reply in one of three ways. First, supply chain due diligence is really difficult. It's just going to involve another supply chain survey and the need to dedicate more internal resources to reviewing and assessing responses. Second, many of the high-risk individuals in anti-corruption, anti-bribery are really pseudo-customers. So you think about a distributor. In many instances, that's the number one buyer of a manufacturer's goods, who takes it all over the basically world for them. Or they're solving some type of a very significant corporate problem. That's generally why a large corporation hires a consultant. It's to help the company get access to a market, help them solve something that's a big problem that they just don't have the internal expertise to do, nor the budget or resource to go and hire and train somebody. So companies become very nervous about interrogating these individuals and potentially harming sales or their ability to gain access to that new lucrative market that they're trying to get into. And companies actually don't really know what to ask. Now, there has traditionally not been any kind of a normalized anti-corruption, anti-bribery supply chain vetting standard in place. So companies have not really had a way to think about it, to investigate access, what it actually should be that an ACAB supply chain survey should be asking, or what level of due diligence they should be conducting. Now that's starting to clarify and come out. Because I'm an attorney, I'm just going to focus on a couple case studies and examples, but I promise I won't go into too much nauseating detail. But let's look at what it is that's coming about and what makes these things risky. So I'm just going to look at three cases, all of which have happened in this year, mind you, which are really starting to clarify what we should be doing and who we should be looking at. The first comes out of PTC in February of this year, and is intended to demonstrate the new attention on individuals and how it can actually yield to quite significant results that the SEC are trying to achieve. Now in this instance, PTC used a just third-party subsidiary, Parametric Technology, and Parametric Technology software company Shanghai. Now these business units were paying for luxury vacations, exotic travel, and really wining and dining to an excessive extent Chinese government officials. The subsidiary staff hid these expenses by charging increased fees for software sales that were executed by Hong Kong and the Shanghai offices. But the SEC started to focus its attention on the individual, as is prescribed by the Yates memo. And one of the sales executives who facilitated the transactions was called in. He happened to cooperate very fully, and Mr. Wan actually helped them to uncover the books and records violations under the FCPA that resulted in about a $28 million USDA settlement in exchange for a 3-year deferred prosecutorial agreement against the individual sales executive. So what lesson do we learn here? Well, in essence, these individual prosecutions are actually probably often going to result in increased disclosure by the individual because they're going to be seeking to mitigate personal liability. And I think that this is a pretty good evidence or a good case study to kind of show what it is that the SEC is after with the Yates memo and how we can expect or anticipate some of the results. It's not going to mean that there's not going to be big fines or big issues. It's going to mean that they're going to go after an individual and issue a big fine or a big penalty against the company. Here's the second one I'd like to spotlight for the moment. It's the matter of Ignacio Puerto Plaza. Now this demonstrates how the use of a third-party intermediary can actually result in direct personal liability to the C-suite. So in this instance, the CEO of a South American LAN Airlines, was engaged in a labor dispute between the company's Argentine-based employees. And what happened here is that the CEO, Mr. Plaza, authorized the payment of $1.15 million USD, United States dollars, to a consultant that was hired under the presumption that they would analyze and prepare a report of flight traffic and support negotiations with the union to try to settle this labor dispute. However, in practice, what happened here was that the case evidenced that no reports were prepared. But in fact, the consultant actually passed on a portion of the fees to the labor union to get them to accept or take a less advantageous labor settlement. Now, that didn't necessarily help the airline. In fact, Mr. Plaza was called in, and he was the person who was charged or didn't actually agree that he was responsible. He didn't put that in the actual settlement decree, but he did agree to personally pay $75,000 USD for his authorization of the payments. So you can see there the key kind of takeaway is that third-party consultants really need to be vetted. These individuals that you're working with or facilitating these types of discussions or transactions or settlements, remember that the personal liability can flow right through to the authorizer. And it wasn't the third-party consultant, and it wasn't LAN Airlines in this example who was in trouble. It was actually the signatory, the individual who agreed to use this consultant, who was the only person that got in trouble during this transaction, the person who actually got hit with the fine. So just an important takeaway to recognize where FCPA enforcement is going. And then the last case study we'll look at today involves around the Nordian and Mikhail Gorovich case that came out in March. And it demonstrates how the use of a third-party intermediary can actually result in a pretty darn costly investigation and even personal liability for mid-level individuals. So you got two sides to the coin here. In this instance, Nordion was a former publicly traded medical isotope provider, publicly traded on the U.S. stock exchange, mind you, but they were taken private by a Canadian firm, so they kind of moved outside the jurisdiction of the normal kind of U.S. SEC review and guidance. Now, the individual involved was an engineer who recommended and hired a Russian-based third-party consultant to help facilitate the ability of the company to license, register, and distribute its products in Russia. And for any of you that are involved in the import or export compliance areas, Russia is one heck of a hard market to get into. So hiring a consultant or a third-party intermediary to support that, or somebody with expertise, actually makes a lot of sense. Even the dollar figures here, $235,043 in fees, is not really actually astronomical when it comes to trying to gain access to a market as big as Russia. And when it comes to the complexity of having to build together the lists of all your controlled goods and products and file them and go through all the export rules and regulations. It's quite a dramatic endeavor, really. But during the post-acquisition due diligence, Nordion actually identified that the distributor agent in this instance had little or no experience with the product types. So they're starting to scratch their head. They further identified that they had no experience with the Russian market full stop, or that Nordion did. So they kind of relied on a whim on this third party. And that Nordion had not provided adequate anti-corruption, anti-bribery training, either to its internal staff or to the external third parties that they ended up using. So the end result here was that Mr. Gorovich had used his friend from his childhood, who happened to be located in Russia now, and had ended up receiving about $100,000 in undisclosed payments from the Russian agent and distributor. So the end result here is that Nordion actually performed a voluntary disclosure, which is the right thing to do if you come into this particular type of a situation. And it probably did a lot to mitigate the impacts of this. Because they identified, in fact, that a portion of the fees that were paid went to bribe government officials. And that actually ended up causing successor liability to Nordion of $375,000. But more importantly, it actually caused liability to Mr. Gorovich of $178,000, so just about half of what the corporation itself was charged with, which is relatively unprecedented in terms of size and scale. So what does this teach us? What do we take away? Is that really the lack of supply chain due diligence and employee oversight training can result in significant penalties, even if a voluntary disclosure occurs and you follow all the appropriate steps and processes. All right, so we've talked a lot about the rules and regulations, where they went, where they came from. We've talked a lot about how they've changed. We've even looked at what current ACABA programs look like and some of the deficiencies that are being identified the task in the SEC's kind of spotlight programs. So let's now take a look at what exactly it is that a business has to do. Now, if you're just to look at the last couple of years' data, you're going to notice a couple trends in what the SEC is highlighting and what they want companies and businesses to pay attention to. Now, they do this through what they call their spotlighted enforcement actions, which go on a website listed here and below. And what I've done is I've taken and I've charted the last 3 years' data on what it was the driving factor, or what caused the SEC to look into this case, and why it is that they selected or wanted us to kind of identify and see this case in all of its detail in their spotlighted reports. And you'll notice that there's really 5 primary categories that are identified. Well, there are 5 primary categories identified. There's potential joint ventures, direct engagement fees and penalties, there's distributor issues, there's vendor consultant issues, and there's subsidiary issues. Now, of those, direct engagement is one area, but it tends to be, when put in context to these other 4 areas, the only one where the company itself is directly paying the bribe or engaged in the corrupt activity. The other 4, and you'll notice what's happened with subsidiaries and vendor consultants, they're both spiking over the course of the last year. Those are areas where it's a third-party intermediary, somebody within the supply chain who is causing the issue. And that is the issue that the SEC is finding the problems in, that they're trying to highlight for us. And you'll even see that if you look back at some of those cases we were pointing at, the mere act of authorizing that third party to do something for you, even if it's not specifically the bribe or the payment or the illicit activity, could potentially be enough to draw you into implication. So it's a critical area and a distinction that you should take a note of as you start to see the trends and where the SEC is asking us to pay more attention. So when it comes to anti-corruption, anti-bribery risks, and figuring that they extend throughout the supply chain, we have to recognize that these risks can come in many forms. For example, a subsidiary paying a bribe can result in an organization being liable. A joint venture or a joint venture partner paying a bribe to win work for the joint venture does create risk for all participants in the joint venture. A procurement manager of a customer or a client demanding a bribe in exchange for a contract award creates liability for both organizations. A client of the organization requiring the organization to appoint a specific subcontractor or a supplier in a circumstance where a manager of the client or a public official may benefit personally creates liability risk. An agent or a third party representing the organization who pays a bribe to a manager of the organization's customer on behalf of the organization makes the represented organization liable. They're an agent. And a supplier or a subcontractor paying a bribe to a procurement manager in exchange for a contract award does create liability for both organizations. And bear in mind that with some of the modern changes or some of the changes to some of the international anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws, that can be a commercial transaction. And it can be both the briber and the bribee, the person receiving it, both sides, who can create liability or implicit liability for the organizations that they represent. Now the next little section here is what I like to call every level has a devil. So what we're looking at here are the different types of controls that are necessary for subsidiaries, joint ventures, customers, client-mandated subcontractors, agents or third parties, and suppliers or subcontractors who pay bribes to procurement managers for preferential treatment. And in each one of these, you have to have slightly nuanced deviations to your program to actually make them meaningful. So just going through a couple of the recommended strategies that Assent sees that we would really kind of promulgate or offer as a potential way to combat some of these issues using our expertise and knowledge. If you're dealing with subsidiary due diligence, you should probably use an independent third party to evaluate and test the programs. And the reason for that is not just because it gives you an impartial view on what your subsidiary, your own organization might be doing, but also because the more oversight that you put on a subsidiary, actually what ends up happening is the higher risk that if something goes wrong in the subsidiary, liability from a commercial perspective can actually flow back to the parent. So a third party can help you mitigate quite a bit of that. The second is a joint venture or joint venture partnership, where we saw several of those instances are always coming in and they're always spotlighted each year. And in this instance, you really need to recommend or insist that there are sufficient internal controls that at least align with your own internal control programs. Don't allow the joint venture to have looser standards than you have. Even if your partner or the individual that you're partnering with might have an entirely different program and one that doesn't really deal with or manage anti-corruption, anti-bribery, they just don't consider it as big of a concern as you do. You need to take the responsibility and basically the bull by the horns in that example, and you need to drive it into the joint venture. The next, a customer or a client bribe demand. Now this, even in a commercial transaction, is de facto illegal in the UK rules. And in these instances, you really have to take a strong stance on ACABA ethics training and whistleblower programs, because this is a very hard thing for your sales force and staff to deal with. If somebody is specifically asking for something and they're making it a contingency on the ability to get that sale, especially a commissioned sales force, there's a lot of competing agendas there, and it can become very ethically and morally challenging for an individual that's faced with, I would like to get this business, and I would also like to earn that commission for my family, versus if I'm going to report this and cause damage to the customer relationship and potentially cause a whole firestorm of illegal actions and behaviors. So that's more of the traditional program. You have to still keep up strong. We also have issues of client-mandated subcontractors or individuals, which are becoming a very pervasive problem, where I say, I want you to use this guy, and the reason I want you to use, I'm not going to tell you, is because he's the guy that gives me a kickback, which I can't get from you directly anymore because your program's actually pretty good. You've also got agents or third-party representatives who are actually serving as some of the more prevalent issues when it comes to ACAB offenses. And these individuals should be receiving some level of survey, some level of diligence, and in the best programs, some level of training and evaluation and notice about whistleblower protections so that individuals, even within those businesses, can let you know rather than go and let the authorities know that there could be an issue here. Now, lastly, the recommended supply chain due diligence surveys, annual updates, supplier training programs, and strong internal trainings of whistleblower components are pretty important. And you could even consider doing those up to your customers in many instances, because in many instances, those could be the folks that are actually imploring or requesting the payment in order to get the business. So it can become something that, although is challenging and can become a little bit of a sensitive issue, can become very important and can save you some significant headaches and liabilities in the future. Now, last area just to call to your attention is that a lot of us have been walking around with not a real clear picture about what supply chain due diligence is when it comes to the supply chain, both upstream and downstream, so your suppliers and your customers and your distributors and your intermediaries. Well, over the years, different individual organizations have been trying to mitigate that, and it started with the OECD, which was the mandate, as you remember, way back in the 70s, where the U.S. was meant to kind of cram that down. And it's continued through the UN Convention, and most recently, there's actually just about to be a standard developed, which I wanted to call your attention to, because a lot of what Assent does are modeled after these rules. And that's the ISO DIS 37001 management system, which is all about identifying the different ACAB laws and legal requirements globally, giving you perspective on how it is that you can manage that and put together a corporate management system, the best practices for leveraging that work, and then also offering you a very detailed and concrete series of guidelines about what constitutes a good program and a best practices program, rather than you just having to take guys like my word for it. It offers you a little bit more of an industry standardized perspective and view. In a sense, taking that to heart, really implementing our systems and controls and our supply chain management programs in furtherance and support of this particular area. Now, one thing that we advocate and we found to be true in all the different rules and regulations that we deal with, and that's that standards are very important. You see, without a standard or something that you can tie to, a lot of the questions that you can ask can often fall on deaf ears. And you don't have that industry perspective behind you to kind of really drive and identify. And inevitably, the following situation or fact pattern happens. That's that a law passes, industry reacts, and eventually forms some type of a standard. At that time, if the standard is logical and functional, and really this ISO standard, the 37001 I pointed to, is really the first one. In all the 40 or 50 years that anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws have come together, this is the first one that's really out there and gives you a perspective of what a management system should look like. But if that happens, it gets picked up and adopted globally. And then companies who adopt the standards end up driving it through the supply chain. So you're probably going to get a form or request of some sort in the coming years, particularly once that standard goes live. And as you look through that, remember that EASY acronym, and that we can try to help you out and make it as easy as possible to prepare, respond to, and have a successful management program that can withhold some of the scrutiny that will come as the standard evolves and gets passed. So Assent ACAB, just a closing thought or two as we kind of wind up this program. I know we're just coming up to the top of the hour here. Really the company's objective, our mission in life is to help solve some of the most complicated compliance risks that are out there. They're imaginable in a lot of ways. And how we do that is really through focusing on the areas that you can automate. You can't automate everything. You can't automate all of your policies. You can't automate all of your review cycles. But you can automate the way that you communicate with people. And you can automate when it is that you send that information out. And you can rely upon folks that have expertise and the skills to make sure that the questions are understood, that they're answered, and that the knowledge is being communicated to you you, your suppliers, and your customers in a way that actually makes sense. It isn't just a glump of legalese coming at folks. So we do that through a number of different programs, platforms, and outreach campaign tools, which the Salesforce and team can talk to you about in much greater detail than I. So I won't digress too far into that area. I'd also have you just a quick moment to make you aware of some of the other upcoming programs that we have. Our conflict minerals programs are going to be emerging over the course of the fall season. We also have some educational summits coming up in Chicago, Boston, and San Jose, and a joint materials management conference that's going on in Tetra Tech over in Chicago in December. So if you happen to be in any of the areas, it'd be great to see you, get a chance to meet in person and to meet some of the team. Lastly, as we close up here, I'm going to open it up just to a couple questions, and if I don't get to you, I'm sorry. I apologize for that. Looks like the hour has just about beaten us, but I am going to have time for about 2 questions here. All right, opening up the survey. Looks like our first one here. Do you need to perform due diligence on suppliers as well? That's a tricky question because the way that a lot of the standards are emerging and the way that a lot of the rules are written, it can be both the briber and the bribee who are at risk. So let's think about that for a second. So say it's one of your internal procurement managers or a distributor that's working for you or an agent, and they're engaging with a supplier. Well, if something happens there and one of your procurement managers, one of your directors over in, say, Asia or South America, some other high-risk area, happens to start demanding favorable treatment, and they do that as a condition of sales, well, that could be something that can have implications for you. And teaching your supply chain how they should communicate that to your organization can actually be a critical way that saves you a lot of trouble and heartburn down the road. So it's a best practice, something to consider definitely as you're rolling out your program, and something that actually Assent really specializes in. So happy to talk to you about that. And I'm getting pinged here by my sales guy. I got time for one more, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to close up. Looks like the clock's just beat me. All right. So this one's actually, it says, so do the Chinese rules really cover families and non-governmental employees? The answer there, from everything I can read, obviously I don't speak Mandarin, but we do have folks in the office that do, is that it can. It's very broad, and the idea behind it was in a lot of ways what the U.S. and the U.K. rules were designed to do, is to expand that scope or that net. How the Chinese elected to do it, or the People's Republic of China criminal enforcement authorities, was really to look at folks that could influence the decision making, even if not that direct individual, because of how close the ties are between family and friendships and other areas. So they were targeting those same consultants, those same third-party intermediaries. They just kind of wrote it in their prescription a little differently to kind of reflect more of the cultural norms that occur there. Well, gosh, guys, with that said, I'm afraid I'm going to have to close up. Thank you all for attending today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to listen to me, and I hope we have the opportunity to have a discussion sometime in the near future. Take care.